happen to be Jewish. My grandfather, like many stories of many Jewish people in the public sphere right now doing the right thing, in my estimation, we learned a hard lesson when our grandparents, our great grandparents escaped the Holocaust, and my grandfather escaped Nazi Germany, and luckily early enough. But his sister's family was murdered in the Holocaust, and he fled to this country, met my grandmother, and raised a wonderful daughter, my mother, and then she, of course, had my brother and me. And growing up with my grandfather, like many people of his generation, he said, "Never again." And never again shall this happen to anybody, regardless of their religion, regardless of where they were born, their beliefs. And my grandfather happened to be the least prejudicial person I've ever known. And so he was a huge influence on me, and is how I kind of came to this work, and particularly how I came to the Palestinian cause.
Welcome back to War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. My guest today is precisely one of the many reasons why I started this podcast. I grew up in a very right-wing community with, for lack of a better term, a bonkers narrative about the United Nations. It was the 1947 UN partition plan that established a Jewish state and British Mandate Palestine was legitimate, making Israel a legitimate state. But just about everything the UN has done since then is illegitimate and anti-Semitic. And there is so much propaganda about UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency, that their website even sells a t-shirt that says millions of dollars of propaganda didn't work on me, which is excellent. You could buy it at the store now. The propaganda has real consequences other than T-shirts. We're recording this on January 27th, and just yesterday, the headquarters in East Jerusalem were set on fire. Last week, they were demolished. In preparing for this interview, a Google search for UNRWA yielded a sponsored result from govextra.co.il. The gov and the il giving it away that it's the Israeli government. So I'm grateful to have Mara Kronenfeld, the executive director of UNRWA USA, to tell me directly as opposed to Google. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Thank you, Orli. It's really wonderful to be here, and thank you for being a part of a community of truth tellers. We need more and more of those in these really dark days, indeed.
Exactly. So let's start with the basics. What is UNRWA, and then why is UNRWA? Why does it exist?
Yeah, excellent. And I'll just back up and say, even before getting to the history of UNRWA, say that I'm the executive director of UNRWA USA, and it is essentially a Friends of organization, a U.S. Organization, and really our mission is to raise awareness about the plight of Palestine refugees, what UNRWA calls Palestinian refugees, and the key services that UNRWA, the UN agency, provides to them: humanitarian services, life-giving services, human development services, and hope in these very, very dark times. And it's important for me to note that while we look and feel the same, I always joke that my own husband doesn't understand the difference. UNRWA USA is an independent 501c3, an NGO, a US-based NGO, and we are separate from legally, financially from the United Nations and UNRWA. So just to make that clear to everyone, and that's the same as, frankly, as UNICEF USA, as USA for UNHCR. Any organization who raises funds from American taxpayers and sends them to a foreign entity, albeit a United Nations agency, has to legally go through its own formal discretion and control process and have full independence over the use of our funds, and that's exactly what we do. Following the law as closely, of course, as humanly possible. So UNRWA, the UN agency, was started in 1949 by mandate of the Community of Nations via the United Nations, and it was started with a mandate to address the humanitarian needs of the refugee population, the population of those living in what was called Palestine before the creation of Israel. And the reason it's called Palestine Refugees is because it meant anybody who was refugeed as a result of the creation of the State of Israel. And in practice, that actually meant Christians, Muslims, and also meant Jews, as it happens, as there were Jewish refugees at that time. Of course, the vast majority, some 760,000 refugees, were Christian and Muslim, were forcibly displaced off their lands and forced to be refugees. And UNRWA was developed first as a temporary measure. It was developed with planned obsolescence, as we say in mind, with the idea that UNRWA is just going to care for the needs of the refugee countries in the host communities where they sought refuge up until there's a just and durable political solution to their plight. And that was by no means the responsibility of UNRWA, humanitarian agency, not a political agency in any sort of sense, but rather the responsibility of the political parties. And unfortunately, as all of us know all too well, there was no political solution, and certainly not a just and durable one. And UNRWA's had to remain around because Palestinians don't have their own sovereign state and self-determination. So we hope someday there will be a just peace. Palestinians will have self-determination, a sovereign state, and the need for UNRWA will be gone. But UNRWA will not be destroyed by illegal actions of the State of Israel or of the U.S. government.
Is there a vision within the organization of what would solve the refugee crisis, or no, it's focused on meeting the day-to-day needs?
Yeah, it's really outside of the scope of the mission of UNRWA. UNRWA, in the official language, related to its mandate, which is reaffirmed every couple of years by the community of nations in the United Nations. But it was really just until there's a just and durable political solution, and it's really up to those political parties on both sides to decide what that is and to make that possible.
So what are the services it provides?
Yeah, so UNRWA has provided really since 1949 food, health, housing, education, and protection services. This population of some 760,000 people who were forcibly displaced grew into a population of up to 6 million refugees. And UNRWA has been serving about 2.5 million of these refugees in five settings, which are Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, so occupied Palestinian territory, and then in Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, with the largest population being in Gaza. And so before what experts know to be a genocide having started some 27 months ago in Gaza, UNRWA was essentially very similar to a Ministry of Health, a Ministry of Education, a Ministry of Planning, because of the breadth of their services in the Gaza Strip, where there are 2 million people. About 60% of those were registered refugees, and UNRWA really was serving many of the same services, providing many of the same services that a Ministry of Education or Ministry of Health would provide. And that included educating from about kindergarten through 9th grade, about 300,000 young people. That's about half the population of school-age children in Gaza. And then providing health care for, again, a significant portion of the population, primary health care. Also taking care of the maintenance of refugee camps where the majority of Palestine refugees were living for decades. And other related services, job training, job placement, technical training, and then protection services for vulnerable populations such as orphans, women facing gender-based violence, and handicapped, developmentally disabled young people. And those similar services are in the other field sites where UNRWA exists as well.
You mentioned education, and that's a particular area that gets its own. There should be a T-shirt about the propaganda about UNRWA schools alone. There was recently a headline in Haaretz that I found really powerful, a quote from one of the executive directors that says, UNRWA doesn't radicalize Palestinians, their lived experience does. So what is actually taught in UNRWA schools?
Yes, this question is so important. And maybe I'll just, I'll back up a little to tell a short story, which will also provide some insight into how I got involved in this work myself. I had the last 20, 30 years working in international development. Out of the United States, I was focused on actually workforce development and youth leadership training, youth development across the Middle East and North Africa. So traveling back and forth to the region. I happen to be Jewish. My grandfather, like many stories of many Jewish people in the public sphere right now doing the right thing, in my estimation, we learned a hard lesson when our grandparents, our great grandparents escaped the Holocaust, and my grandfather escaped Nazi Germany, and luckily early enough, but his sister's family was murdered in the Holocaust. And he fled to this country, met my grandmother, and raised a wonderful daughter, my mother, and then she, of course, had my brother and me. And growing up with my grandfather, like many people of his generation, he said, "Never again," and never again shall this happen to anybody, regardless of their religion, regardless of where they were born, their beliefs. And my grandfather happened to be the least prejudicial person I've ever known, and so he was a huge influence on me, and is how I kind of came to this work, and particularly how I came to the Palestinian cause. So 6 years ago, I started this job as executive director of UNRWA USA, and I heard from friends and relatives, some, only a few, but I heard UNRWA, they're anti-Semitic. Why would you join UNRWA? So, and to be honest, this was one of the first times I'd really heard this. Maybe it was in the background, so I started to really get involved in understanding this for myself. So you're talking to someone who spent the last 6 years trying to understand where this idea came from, how it came about, and the mythology, frankly, behind it. Like much of the mythology many of us learned as kids growing up about who was on offense and who was on defense in the Middle East. So I started to research this, and I've just come to know, so much about it. It's the curriculum. UNRWA's curriculum is called Antisemitic. UNRWA doesn't even have its own curriculum. Number one, the curriculum that UNRWA teaches, like in any development context, is the curriculum of the home country. So the actual curricula comes from the Palestinian Authority. It's the curriculum that the Palestinian Authority uses in Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and UNRWA then, in any development context, has to teach the local curriculum because they need their ninth graders to matriculate into the public school system. And if they're teaching an entirely different curriculum, they can't do that. So UNRWA, when it is found anything objectionable, i.e. Racist, anti-Semitic, anything against the UN values of tolerance and respect for difference, it marks those and gives alternative teaching materials, supplemental teaching materials to the teachers. So the one big misnomer out there is as if UNRWA had its own curriculum. In fact, it has supplemental materials which are meant to address anything objectionable in the existing curriculum. And in fact, when the curriculum and these materials were reviewed, in the case of the curriculum, the most recent study was showing less than 1% of anything objectionable, and that objectionable refers in many cases to maps, of the region, which are from the river to the sea maps that Netanyahu himself brought to the United Nations, a map that Israeli politicians use all the time, and then a mention of jihad in a religious context. And there's only been, I think, one or two cases of what somebody can legitimately call anti-Semitism, and I don't want to talk too much more, but just to say, we have to understand the context of occupation. This is wrong. Anti-Semitism is wrong, but 100%, no question. But we also want to understand what is in the Israeli textbooks in this moment that is anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian. I have certainly seen videos of schools in Israel talking about dirty Arabs and things that I would not dare to repeat here in this podcast.
Yes, 1% objectionable is less objectionable than my education. I'm probably 2%, twice as many. Yeah, and so you mentioned the Palestinian Authority. Is that also the case in Gaza, or
yes?
Even
yeah. To answer, it's the same curriculum, and so often it's called. I've heard people say the Hamas curriculum. It's the same curriculum the Palestinian Authority uses. The Department of Education in the West Bank in East Jerusalem and in Gaza.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask the question about any connection between October 7th and UNRWA employees, just to give you the opportunity to explain the statistics.
Yeah, absolutely. We were as horrified at UNRWA USA, frankly, as anyone was to hear that the allegation from Israel that some number of UNRWA staff from Gaza may or may not have been involved in the horrific attacks of October 7th, and since that time, Israel has made numerous allegations about UNRWA, about many organizations. Most recently 37 NGOs, and some of those, there was a government report saying they were infiltrated by Hamas. At any rate, these allegations came out, and we were trying to understand, as was UNRWA, what was there any truth to the allegations, and in the end, there were essentially 6 different independent investigations, which showed and which reaffirmed UNRWA's neutrality and completely showed no evidence of any infiltration of Hamas in UNRWA by any means. In fact, talk about low percentages. Where the Office of Investigatory Services of the United Nations, the United Nations highest investigatory authority, what their report showed was that 9 individuals that Israel present evidence. Excuse me for this long sentence, but it's presented evidence that, if authenticated and corroborated, because they could not do that, this was while the genocide is ongoing, could indicate that these 9 people may have participated in the horrific events of October 7th. If this was found true, if this evidence was authenticated and corroborated, these people may have very well participated. UNRWA did the right thing. They fired those individuals immediately. Some argued that was reverse due diligence because this evidence was not authenticated and corroborated, but to save the agency and the important work it does, it fired those individuals and said that anybody participating in such activities would be betraying Palestinian refugees and betraying UNRWA. So it's really important that UNRWA had zero tolerance for anything like this. And if those 9 people were involved, 9 people out of a population of 13,000 workers in Gaza, UNRWA staff, and 30,000 up to 33,000 staff members across the 5 sites is 0.03% of the workforce. And I will tell you, look at the U.S. Postal Service, probably a bad example. But if there are not 0.03% criminals within the post office, I'd be surprised. And would that mean that the whole Postal Service is a criminal operation? Absolutely not. UNRWA did the right thing. They did the best thing they could to protect the agency and all of the 2.5 million refugees it serves.
Thank you. And what can you tell us about the situation on the ground right now, be it the West Bank or Gaza. It's just fascinating that like the yeah, the media environment is talking about the Midwest as opposed to the West Bank, that we're seeing similar violence. It's been dizzying. What can you tell us about what's happening?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's been the last 27 months have been, I keep saying, a marathon of misery for those watching. Of course, whatever we're watching does not at all compare to the absolute hell people are living under on the ground. This hell continues to this day. I think there's been about 500 Palestinians killed in Gaza since the so-called ceasefire. This is certainly the level of killing is lower, but 500 people killed since the October ceasefire is still extraordinary, and something that is extremely painful to witness. That didn't have to happen. None of this had to happen. And in the 27 months, we have over 19,000 children who've been killed, over 40,000 children who have one or more of their parents have been killed. We have over 40,000 children injured. We have over 6,000 children who have lost one or more of their limbs, who've been maimed, and representing the largest cohort of child amputees in history, anywhere, in modern history. Uh, the atrocities upon atrocities we've seen, unfortunately, they continue, despite this idea that there's a ceasefire, despite this idea, and I don't know how many of your viewers and listeners understand, because it's purposefully obfuscated, but Gaza has been divided into a so-called green zone, where the Israeli military is, and that's over 53% of the land of Gaza, a red zone where 90% of the human beings live, where 90% of the Palestinians in Gaza live, the so-called red zone, where Israel is not supposed to go, and then a yellow line dividing that, and the yellow line keeps getting pushed into the red zone by the Israelis, and then Israelis are still bombing within the red zone, as recently as yesterday, bombing Gaza City. And so many of those deaths are primarily within that red zone. And so people are still facing violence. We've seen refugee camps being targeted. People are also facing the absolute challenging winter conditions. We've seen tents being blown by the winds, being flooded by rain and the ocean. Israel is still limiting humanitarian aid. They're letting in more commercial trucks, which mean that people who have money can pay for goods. So we're seeing more goods generally, but not enough humanitarian goods by any means, and many items that are necessary for winterization, for handling this winter, are not being let in because they're called so-called dual-use items. So sometimes tents are restricted, tent poles.
What That propaganda doesn't even make sense. What would another use be?
I know, and I can't tell you, one of the things that really just blows your mind when you're involved in this every day is, I'll give you another example, which is even harder to understand, is at least as of a couple of weeks ago, which I believe is still true, Israel was declaring dual-use items, stationery, pencils, and scissors.
My
School
God.
scissors. So those are the scissors that we can't even as adults use, and it can't cut anything, because they're so-called dual use. And that is horrifying to understand what's behind that, the implications, the idea that education is a threat. And especially in a place like Gaza, where before these atrocities, Gaza had a 97% literacy rate. I've known some of the smartest people come out of Gaza, because what was there to do in a setting in which the area was blockaded by air, sea, and land, which you couldn't even leave without permission from the Israeli authorities. You couldn't get back in without permission. How do you succeed in life and have hope? You get educated, and you become the best student you can be. And so there were brilliant students who came out of Gaza. I know so many people who, back in another era, had immigrated to the U.S. and they work at Apple, at Memorial Sloan Kettering curing cancer. The person who put the helicopter that flew on Mars, Loaya Bassiuni, who helped engineer that, was an UNRWA student from Gaza. I can name so many more. And now Israel is basically denying education at scale. UNRWA is still trying. Many organizations are still trying, but only when safety allows, which is rare, and without paper and pencils brought in.
Oh my gosh, that's yeah. The only thing I could say is Shonda.
Yeah.
That makes me nauseous. Yeah, tell me about some of the people you've met as part of your work.
Yeah.
Yeah, shout out to the aerospace engineer. That's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, I got to go to Gaza for the first and only time in 2022, and went there. You know, you hear all these things, and nothing prepares you for what you find there on so many levels. One is crossing from Erez border into Gaza, and this dystopian no man's land in between Israel and Gaza, these 60-foot walls, and you're being interrogated in a sense by somebody whose voice is coming out of a speaker, faceless, and then you go through different aspects of your stuff, people going through your stuff. Okay, that's normal, but it's the physical environment is meant to be intimidating and frightening, and it is. You get in to Gaza, you don't know what to expect. You go through a long kind of tunnel, and what I saw, driving into Gaza City at that time were families walking out on the corniche, little toy vendors with kind of cheap Chinese toys there that the kids were buying. You saw life. You saw people smiling in the face of resilience despite the challenges, and I got to go to a couple of schools, which I mean, this is sometimes the part that like eats at me the most. I visited the schools. I visited these so-called, what people call these schools. These were amazing places where children were learning, self-esteem. We're learning tolerance. We're building the skills that would give them a future career. And I remember meeting so many young women, and no offense to the men, I always say, but the women were just on fire in terms of their brilliance. And these women all wanted to be computer coders. And because that was the one way around the blockade of air, sea, and land was through the cloud. And so they all wanted to do kind of online business processing, things you could do remotely. And what I kept hearing was the most marriageable women in Gaza were the ones who scored the highest on their high school exit exams, because the chance for success. And so I saw these brilliant women, and Gaza was building up a culture and an ecosystem around online work that was helping people build careers and build incomes when they didn't have the freedom to come and go. Mind you, that moment in time, those 17 years of blockade were horrible at the time. People couldn't Israel controlled what went out, goods and people. They stopped fishing from certain miles out from the shore. But compared to this, that was, in retrospect, a beautiful time. It was not freedom. It was not self-determination. It was still occupation of a different sort. But it was a time when people found a way, despite all the challenges that was handed them and all the military strikes that happened in those years.
Wow, and you mentioned, yeah, just and durable peace. I know it's outside of the agency's purview, but do you have any thoughts on this so-called Board of Peace, on what the United States says it's going to do there?
Yeah, I mean, all I can say as a human being is it's take my institutional hat off. Just as a person, I could say that a board of peace that is supposed to be helping Gaza develop into a future peaceful state, place, should have its own people as a part of that governing body. So the fact that there are no Palestinians in the different layers of the so-called board of peace defies all human sense, all common sense and logic. So just as an individual looking at this, I mean, imagine we in the US have Canada coming in here and saying, things are a bit rocky there in the US, no more
True.
immigrants,
Yeah.
and Canada may have a point. But instead of you guys, voting in, working on what you can do, we're going to come in there and we're going to establish, some international actors, including Putin and whoever, to decide what your future is going to be. We all deserve, self-determination, and that is a very problematic a part of the so-called peace. And also, we just haven't seen peace. I wish for peace.
Yeah, but what does peace look like, do you think?
Yeah, on a political level, again, I can't comment, but it's people not being afraid that if they're going to wake up dead, that families aren't deciding we're all going to sleep together, so that if we die together.
That's happening?
Yeah, I've heard of many stories, especially when the bombing was so intense. I heard that across the board from even my own colleagues, family, Hani Matlow, his family, really every night going to bed thinking, if we disperse, only some of us will die. If we're in the same room, we die together, 100%. There were at one time, and I think this has held true through most of the last two plus years, there were at any one moment 50,000 pregnant women, and imagine those pregnant women going for months without showers, waiting in lines of hundreds and hundreds to use the bathroom, because of the destruction of 90% of buildings in Gaza, and of the destruction of many of the shelters, which were UNRWA schools, which turned into shelters. There are very few bathrooms. Imagine mothers giving birth in completely unsanitary conditions. Even we know that for a while, and I'm not sure this is still true, it's very hard to find information on these dual use items, but we know that sanitary napkins were considered dual use. And so there weren't enough sanitary napkins, so that we heard of stories of a father using the last clothes that he had to form some sort of material that his daughter could use. These stories are just abound. So we need safety and security as a number one, but we need autonomy. We need self-determination,
and pens and paper
and pens and papers in school.
and
100%.
and
Yeah.
oh my gosh,
And control of your own borders. 100%.
I want to hear more about your travels. Where else have you visited? And are there any other stories of people you've met that motivate your work?
Yeah. I mean, I had the beautiful opportunity to travel a lot. In addition to my grandfather having influence on me, my dad was an anthropologist. We grew up with this idea of understanding the world around us. Oh, that there was a much bigger world than the one we were raised in, and so I got to travel a lot. And then in my professional and adult life, like I said, traveled across the Middle East and North Africa, from Morocco to Oman. I had a Fulbright scholarship in Syria for 2 years, so I lived there, and I
Oh,
think one of
when? Like when in history?
from 2001 to 2003, so long before the Civil War. But it was in that moment, except for the political repression, of course, which ironically or frankly, as Americans, we didn't feel, but we knew friends, Syrian friends and Palestinian friends who did feel that. But it was a little bit of a what I call pre-capitalist paradise, in the sense that we were welcomed into people's homes, whether Syrian or Palestinian refugees. I spent a lot of my time in Yarmouk, a Palestinian refugee camp, and had some very good friends there. But you'd walk down the street, and families in Damascus, and families would somebody come out and say, "Oh, where are you from?" And I'd say the States. And this, mind you, this was right after 9/11. I went 20 days after 9/11. And they would say, I would say, American. They say, "Oh, come into our house." So I meet. They say, "I want you to meet my daughter." I come in, and then before you know it, you're having dinner, and then you're having tea, and then you're having dessert, and then you're having mette, this drink that Syrians drink, and then you say, "I got to go home. It's getting late." They say, "No, spend the night. Spend the night. What's wrong? Why do you want to be alone?" So this was the case. Just everywhere you went, the hospitality was so gracious, was so meaningful, was so transformative to me. Just the U.S. isn't the same in that way necessarily. Small communities are, but not generally. And and people wanted to get to know you and do all sorts of things to help you, and money was irrelevant. And that's why I call it a pre-capitalist, in the sense that the community looked out for you and cared for you, um, yeah, it was extremely meaningful. And so that's been a part of my life, is wanting to tell my own truth to people here, and frankly to many Jewish family members and friends who've been brought up with a certain mythology. They hate us. I was Jewish where I went, and I mean, in the sense that I didn't go out of my way to not say it, and there was nothing about me being Jewish. There certainly were questions about my political beliefs, and it's so important in this day, and your podcast is a part of this, in this community, to be able to criticize a government that is doing inhumane things, and that has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. And it is our obligation, as I'm guessing, or as Jewish
Oh,
people, to
absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
to say that. And I can't tell you how many Israelis have told me to say that, because they're not able to say it as loudly as we can, as influentially as we can. They feel that's those people who are fighting on the right, on the right side in Israel. So I like to say it every time I can, that it's our duty to criticize inhumane practices as thinking humane people, and that has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. That's part of being Jewish for me.
Yeah, me too. Part of being Jewish is celebrating access to paper and pens. I keep harping on that because that really hits deep for me. And yeah, have you traveled within Israel, or worked within Israel?
Yeah, my grandmother, I was only granddaughter. There were a bunch of grandsons. This is my father's mother. And she, back in the day, she said, "Well, I'm going to take you because you're the only girl. It's just easier to choose that way." And we went, we were supposed to go actually to China. It was 1989, and it was the same year of the Tiananmen Square massacres. Last minute,
And more inhumane practices that, had I been around, I would have criticized as well.
100,
Yeah.
100%. So she said, "Well, let's go to Eastern Europe." And, this was right before the Berlin Wall fell, and the whole Eastern Europe changed. So I said, "Okay." And then she said, "Well, on the way, we're going to visit Israel." And I had never been. And I will tell you, even in that time, it was 1989, I was quite young, but uh, I think that what I saw, even to my mind at that time, was problematic, um and it was a profound feeling to be around Jewish people, given the history of what Jews have suffered, and to feel like to feel different, and in a positive way, yet see elements of apartheid, and see the distinctly different treatment of Arabs, of Palestinians, was marked to me, even in that time. And so there's certain images that will stick with me, and it's been something that I've just being anti-racist, being thoughtful about vulnerable communities. It's just something that has been a focus of mine my entire life. Been part of being a minority in the U.S., I think. But
Thank you. And so, as we wrap up, how can we help, as people listening who also want to be anti-racist? Ch-
yes. Yeah.
challenge these systems.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's I guess I'm no different than anybody else. And I know that I once had training in an organization around anti-racism and around around what we call implicit bias. And that was some work actually we're doing with McDonald's and training a workforce for McDonald's in my old job at a place called International Youth Foundation. And so we had this training on implicit bias, like what is in our head that even those of us who are trying so hard to not judge people, what are we doing? What are we taking with us that is allowing those judgments to happen at an almost subconscious level? And that training really marked me. And I think about that all the time vis-a-vis Palestine, all the time vis-a-vis Arabs and Muslims. I think I happen to have kids that are half Jewish, half Muslim, and I often think about the challenges they're going to face in life. And right now, I mean, anybody may have a different answer, but for me, I'm much more concerned about anti-Muslim hate and anti-Arab hate than I am about anti-Semitism. That could change at any minute. I would rather not think about either of it, but any of it, but I have to. And so I think everyone challenging those own assumptions, especially among the Jewish community, our own assumptions about Arabs and Muslims, and not just the Jewish community, any community who's not from those communities, just to challenge what implicit biases are in our subconscious and how we might think something might be normal or about a population that just because we've heard so many stereotypes. I challenge those every single day, so I ask people to do that on a kind of philosophical and personal growth level. I ask myself these questions every single day, but also on a advocacy level. I mean, we started with what you rightly explained is the unlawful demolition of UNRWA's headquarters in Jerusalem. So we ask that everybody publicly condemn this. This is an attack on multilateralism, an attack on the UN. It is absolutely unprecedented for a UN member state, Israel, to go in and destroy property of the United Nations. If this can happen in Jerusalem, to UNRWA, to the United Nations, it can happen anywhere. UNRWA has unfortunately been the tip of the spear. What Israel is doing to UNRWA and the U.S. could be done to any organization. We've seen the same tactics play out even up through aspects of what's happened in Minneapolis, as you said. We need the immediate restoration of UNRWA's headquarters in Jerusalem. We want to demand that Israel, like every other country, is supposed to uphold international law and protect humanitarian agencies. And we're asking those in America to support the U.S. government's funding of UNRWA's life-saving work. There's a bicameral bill in Congress, both in the House and the Senate, aiming to do exactly that, the restoration of emergency funding for UNRWA. UNRWA still remains the largest humanitarian actor in Gaza to this day. There are 11 to 12,000 staff members every day working, as I said, to try to provide education under extremely difficult settings. They're educating about 60,000 children in temporary learning spaces a week, about 200,000 to 300,000 online. This is not real yet education, reading, writing, arithmetic, but it's the things that can keep these children hopeful and thinking in the near term. UNRWA's providing medical care to approximately 50% of those patients seeking care in Gaza. This is not what UNRWA was meant to be, but so many of the humanitarian actors have been barred recently that UNRWA is that primary medical caretaker. UNRWA is providing drinking water to hundreds of thousands, psychosocial support, and finally cleaning up like equivalent of 300,000 tons, a 747, a loaded plane of waste and of rubble that is across the Gaza Strip that people are trying to make a living around. So continue to support UNRWA, continue to question the propaganda. $150 million of Hezbollah going into to try to demonize a UN agency. And anybody who's interested, go to our website, UNRWAUSA.org, and you can look up advocacy for more actions you can take.
Thank you so much. I truly appreciate you taking the time to cover both the history, the present, and practical things people can do right now. I'll link to the website in the show notes.
Excellent. Thank you, Orli. Thank you for your labor of love, and for, I mean, I can't tell you how wonderful it is to have to feel so many people in community on the right side of history, and these dark days will truly pull you under unless you find ways to reach out to those who are thinking along the same lines and are really humane in their focus, and that's the light that keeps us all going. And so it's been really wonderful to be here with you today.
Thank you so much. That means a lot to me. Thank you for listening and or watching War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. Please subscribe, rate and review, tell your dads. We'll see you next time.